Good afternoon. I'm Lena D'Astilio, and I serve as the University of Pittsburgh's Associate Vice Chancellor for Community Engagement. I want to welcome you to the main stage presentation featuring national perspectives on critical and liberatory community engagement. I'm joined today by three leaders in this movement: Michelle Fine from the Public Science Project, Tania Mitchell from the University of Minnesota, and Chris Naive from the Mulvaney Center at the University of San Diego. We'll first hear from each of our esteemed guests. They'll share with us a bit about themselves and the work. Then I'll return to moderate a live dialogue. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions and join us through the question and answer session. And now I give you Michelle Fine, Tania Mitchell, and Chris Naive.
My friendly amendment would be our work is at the Public Science Project at the Graduate Center. We are engaged as researchers with community activists, with organizers, with women in prison, with queer youth, with women whose lives and labor has been disrupted by COVID-19. We collectively engage in research to document oppression, document privilege, document resistance, and help folks tell a counter story to the one that's being told about them, and generate material that can be used in campaigns for a sweeter tomorrow. So as researchers, we work with community-based organizations, with activists, and with communities under siege to collaboratively generate research that works alongside struggles for justice. I can tell three genealogy stories. I come to the work as the daughter of Jewish immigrants from Poland. My mom, refugees, Jews. My mom was the youngest of 18. And I grew up during an era that Karen Brodkin Sachs would call when the Jews became white. So I could bear witness to the ways in which kind of trading identities to whiteness in the US enabled us a set of advantages about which I've always had certainly pleasure and radical discomfort. So there's the genealogy of privilege and activism. Although my father sold junk on the Lower East Side, we were not wealthy at all, but whiteness escorted me into academic spaces in particular that afforded me a set of privileges. So that's one lineage. A second lineage is academically, I'm the granddaughter of Kurt Lewin. My mentor, Morton Deutsch, worked with the action researcher Kurt Lewin, who understood the relationship of person and environment and the importance of action research. And so my work has always been in justice studies. And the third story is not a story I tell a lot, but my first book was a book called Framing Dropouts, and it was an ethnography of a public high school in New York City, mostly kids of color. I spent a year at the school and then wrote a book on how race and class help shape public institutions in a way that produces massive failure for communities of color, with kind of no one being held accountable for that. And it was a book that got famous fast, and it was kind of told from the point of view of the young people who were pushed out. The opening segment begins with a field note to myself where I'm at graduation and 250 kids are graduating in a school of 3,000. And I note that I'm crying and taken by the beauty of the parents and the grandparents and the relatives and the friends from Puerto Rico and the Bronx and Harlem. And I want a moment of silence for the 500 bodies that are missing when 750 started ninth grade and 250 graduated. And that book got famous fast for good reasons, and I fear bad ones. And someone I respected said to me, Michelle, it's a great book, but your representation of the teachers is, now this is probably my word, not theirs, but it's two-dimensional. They're kind of stick figures in a complicit system, and you feature with complexity the students who are pushed out, but not the teachers. And is that fair to the teachers? And I'm not sorry I wrote the book, but that really struck me that my preference turned at that point to more participatory work with communities and professionals and practitioners to try to understand how we have come to the circumstances in which we find ourselves and how it might be otherwise, rather than to feature one group and by reference make thin and superficial the characterization of the folks who are trying to make a difference in impossible circumstances.
As I think about my work, I have come to call myself a critical friend of community engagement. I am particularly interested in helping us as a field think about the ways that we do the work, the harms that may result from this work if we don't focus in on our intention and our relationships, and the push for us to do better as a field, as a movement of community engaged people to bring about a more just world. As I think about how I come to this work, I'm immediately transported back to my own undergraduate education experiences, which is where I was first introduced to the practice of service learning or community engagement. I was a first-year student, first in my family to go to college, having moved relatively far away from home, 3 whole hours. And I had an opportunity to do a service option connected to a class. Do these 20 hours in the community and you will not have to write a 20-page paper. As a first generation college student, a 20-page paper sounded really intimidating to me at the time. And I really truly believed that service in the community would be an easy way out. And so recognizing that as the worst possible reason to do work in the community, I signed up immediately. And what I came to understand through that experience was how much more powerful my understanding of the course concepts, of the ways that systems and structures operated, that made my work in the community desired, if not necessarily needed or necessary, how all of those things worked together. And as I continued to do work in the community, I recognized that I was not the primary audience for the work that we were doing, right? Service learning and community engagement has often been about educating those who are in what we've come to call the majoritized position, or the dominant space, a privileged space in terms of their life and experiences, and introducing them to social concerns and creating space for them to contribute, hopefully in meaningful ways, to those social concerns. But for someone like myself, who moves to the world as a Black woman, who has experienced racism, who has experienced poverty, who was not necessarily new to the concerns or conditions that my peers were often being introduced to through their service learning and community engagement experiences, it allowed me to recognize that there was a whole space of work where people who look like me were not being honored, recognized, or even considered in terms of the ways that these experiences were structured. And so I have been really interested in thinking about how we move from a space that is about introducing people to concerns to actually motivating, engaging thoughtfully and meaningfully in ways that will respond fully, forcefully, with an actual intention of transformation in place, that we actually look at how we might remedy the social concerns rather than just introducing students to them, and in ways that honor the experiences of all of the students who are in the classroom, so that students from minoritized or marginalized experiences aren't put on display, but are also valued for the knowledge and experience that they bring, and where community knowledge is honored and uplifted and valued as central to understanding what is happening in community and the ways that we can impact and influence what the communities that we care about look like moving forward.
Fundamentally and broadly, my goal, or what my work is that I work in community and economic development at the University of San Diego. I also lead our place, space, and our anchor initiatives, which fundamentally means that I work to develop partnerships between our campus and the community, as well as our region, to make sure that our campus community is really involved in some of the most pressing issues affecting our region. That is my title, and that is what I do. And then I would say that my work is about, the practice of joining, and how do I do that? Thinking about this question, I was thinking about my work within the context of who signs my paycheck and what's my title. And then going deeper, I just felt compelled to start by saying that actually, going beyond my title and going beyond where it is I work, I started to think, well, what is it that I'm drawn towards? And, when I think about this question, I'm realizing that I'm just drawn towards building relationships that really allow us to be visible and to be more fully who we are. I think when I think of my work from there, then everything else can kind of broaden a little bit. And if my work starts there, it helped me think about this idea of the work as part of what my colleagues call the practice of joining. And my colleagues John Loggins and Esteban Del Rio actually wrote an article in Kumu about this idea of the practice of joining, about how do we integrate mindfulness, how do we integrate attentiveness to kind of really build relationships, especially as it relates to campus and community. And so I had to flip this idea of what is my work so I can think about what I do as a practice and how I want to be. And so it just so happens that I'm drawn to the field of community and civic engagement and public service, and in particular in higher education, where I feel the practice of joining and community building are really important elements of what we do. And I also think framing what I do as a vocation and practice, it also means that it could be universally applied to wherever I go. Now, I'm lucky that I get to be working in a space that I really enjoy working in. I think it also means that if my work is a daily practice, it could be applied anywhere I go. And I think I look back, regardless of where I've worked or where I've been, this idea of building relationships is something I've always been drawn towards. And in our field of community engagement and community development and how we define this work broadly, the practice of building strong relationships is really important. And early on when I was thinking of this work, early in my career, I was thinking, well, my work as my title, my identity tied up into my title and who signs my paychecks. I just found it really hard to define what I do. My parents would always ask, like, well, what is it that you do? And I never had a great answer. I wish I always had a great answer. And, sometimes I would think, well, my job is to catalyze the mission of higher education. in order to solve the most pressing social issues. And it's like, hello, ego. So I think now, I just firmly believe that my work is focused on how I can be in the service of the idea that what our colleagues at Rutgers Newark express. I love how they call what it is they do. They say 1 + 1 = 3, because we're really more than the sum of our parts. And, just as an example to that, when I started getting into more leadership roles, I realized that I do bring some strengths and skills to the table. And there are a lot of things that I don't bring to the table. And I'm so appreciative to work with so many great collaborators and team members. And some of them, John Loggins and Maria Silva and others. And they have strengths and skills that I don't bring. And indeed, they're like these wonderful and brilliant humans. And they lift everyone up around them. So I want to be standing in the service of that and lifting up their brilliance. So to me, that's the 1 + 1 = 3. To me, that's the sweet spot of, I guess, how I would define what is my work. It's not tense or territorial. It's open, it's expansive. It still can be critical. It just means that we're clear that the critique is about advancing our shared values and not shutting things down.
And so I'm really delighted that we just had the opportunity to sit with Tania and Michelle and Chris and hear a bit more about how they are speaking of their work, our work, as Michelle calls us and challenges us to think. And we wanted to be able to capture some of the behind the scenes thinking for this session, make that available both in the session now, but also after our conversation has concluded. There are much longer sections of those recordings that we'll be able to take advantage of and pull into our practice environments. And at this point, we get to move into more of a live conversation. And so unlike some of our other sessions today at the Community Engaged Scholarship Forum, this is going to be a dialogue amongst colleagues and friends, not a panel, not sort of a moderated sequence of questions. And to start us off, I want to reflect that we carefully chose the framing for this session around labeling work as critical or liberatory and defining the ways in which that feeds or perhaps maybe even bumps against the current practices of engagement within higher education. We heard from Michelle that her work at the Public Science Project is around co-production, around a collaborative and participatory idea of knowledge generation and advocacy. And we heard from Tania that a lot of her work is really as a critical friend, thinking about engaged learning, service learning. And we heard from Chris that his space of joining is really around knitting together partnerships and collaborations that can, in fact, feed economic development within his institution and surrounding communities. Well, at Pitt, our work is frequently about building platforms for partnership around how institutionalizing and sustaining long-term commitments and relationships. And I was with my team in conversation. We were talking about how we understand our work, how we articulate that work. Do we even have a vocabulary for the practices that we've so organically sewn together as members of our communities, not separated by university and community, but really members of our communities? And one of my colleagues, Darren Ellerby, shared with me that one of her fears is, should I leave this position, and I know she will someday, would the person that comes behind her understand the commitments that have been made and understand the artfulness that needs to be practiced in this work? And that, I think, is around building a practice of critical engagement, liberatory engagement. So I know our team has been working hard to articulate and make visible that kind of work and approach to knitting together engagement. It's one that I heard echoed in each of my colleagues' remarks. And I actually wanted to see if we could kick off today's discussion by tapping to Tania. Tania, I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about your identity as a critical friend to the movement of community engagement in higher education, and help us to understand, what does that enable you to do, and where there might be limitations for that?
I don't know what it enables me to do. That's a great question. Create space for people to be mad at me? I'm not sure. Um, I think I identify myself as a critical friend because I cannot deny how much I have connected and grown and learned through my own community engagement experiences. And my critique is deeply based in a desire for all of us to do this work in the ways that communities deserve for us to do this work. And so I believe in the transformative potential of community engagement. I believe that colleges and universities have the resources to partner authentically and meaningfully with communities and work in ways that will make them more hospitable, more thriving, more generative and generous places for everyone who considers themselves a part of that community. And so it has enabled me to be less afraid of calling out work that I think is troublesome or problematic. It has enabled me to be more discerning about the spaces where I enter and the decisions that I make around my own community engaged practice. But I think it has also, in some ways, been paralyzing, right? In wanting to make sure I do it right, right? As right as I complain about others doing it wrong, and wanting to make sure that I'm the right person, right? And or even if I know that I'm not the right person, that the intentions that I'm entering with are appropriate and will benefit the spaces where I'm choosing to engage and not do more harm or additional harm or unintended harm. I think it's been a real balancing act for me in terms of recognizing the spaces where I see the kind of work I don't want to replicate, that I want to challenge, in terms of the ways that I see higher education approaching engagement, and making sure I can walk my talk, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Michelle, Chris, what does that bring up for you? This rightness piece struck me, but I'm curious if there's any bit of that truth for you.
Go ahead, Chris.
Well, it's good to be live with everybody here. I think, I would only add that, I guess naming it liberatory and critical community engagement is just the truth. And, critical and liberation focused community engagement, as Tania was saying, is just different than transactional and charitable endeavors. And when traditional community engagement only stays in the charity space, it is bound and it's conditioned and it's actually not free and potentially fraught with oppression. So I think critical community engagement, liberatory thinking is really built for the long haul. It's generational work. It's not focused on quarters or semesters. And this idea of being really rooted in assets and building relationships. I often think about Father Boyle, who talks about doing this work is about widening the circle of compassion so nobody stands outside that circle. And I guess just for me, anything not in the surface of that cannot in their nature be in the spirit of liberation. So, for me, other terms and ways of thinking that connect for me around this idea is freedom, truth, sovereignty without conditions. Because if the conditions exist, they have to be co-created conditions. Otherwise, it's not mutuality or it's not reciprocity. And I think those are some of the things I think about when I hear Tania, also kind of knowing Michelle's work. And Tania, just know, I mean, who could be mad at Dr. Mitchell? So I'll just leave it at that.
Well, let me join and say I love being here with all of you. I think as a white academic, maybe I have to enter this a little differently, which is to think, to position critical and liberatory as a way to contest privilege, whiteness, wealth, the exclusion, and the colonial practices of university in communities, often in communities of color. I taught at University of Pennsylvania. I went to Columbia. I knew the predatory practices by day, even though there was charity, or by night, even though there was charity by day. So I do a lot of thinking about the obligation of white academics in particular to call out power, privilege, and exclusion. All of our work is critical insofar as, like, power is at the heart of it, calling out inequities, understanding not only oppression, but privilege. Who benefits from the current structures? Who gets arrested for protesting and who doesn't? Who gets long sentences and who gets alternatives? Who has bandwidth during COVID so that online learning is accommodated, and who's crawling on their mama's phone, right? So it feels to me, at least, I mean, I love the work that Tania and Chris do, and our work is rooted less in engagement and more in a critical participatory research. And for us, there are, deep non-negotiables. It's community-led. The money goes to the community. The research is determined by community. I've got gifts to offer, but I am staff to what a movement or community needs. I don't want to just evacuate my own contribution. That's not my point. But it's critical because it's community-led. We are very lucky now that movements turn to us and say, help us document aggressive policing, help us document the struggles of women in prison who were experiencing domestic violence. And then we do that work with those women. We do those work alongside formerly incarcerated folks. So there's an old essay by Jane Addams, to pick up on Chris's point, and it marks the moment where she understood that charity was insufficient, that charity reproduced social hierarchy by helping rather than justice, which is about transformation. So I think when we're talking about critical engagements, whether it's scholarship or practice or joining, it feels really important that we begin from a place that understands power inequities exist. And we have an obligation to challenge those and help folks imagine what else is possible.
There was a question in the audience around the implications of our language, right? And the implications of language for the work that we are doing, if we can see that as shared work. So specifically, the question reads, what difference does it make if we speak of social change rather than social justice? And if we call ourselves a field rather than a movement, or both, vice versa. Lots of other examples of the power of words, of course. These are the two that I'm thinking of, but would love to understand the implications of the language that we choose. Anybody want to respond to that one?
I'm just so glad I'm not the one who's ringing. I'm so relieved.
Well, in all fairness, that was me. I asked everybody to turn off their dings and blings, and I can't figure out how to turn that off. And so I thought I turned off my phone.
You're making me look good. Do one of you want to take up this question?
Well, I'm going to possibly be a rule breaker here and actually invite Lena. Would you mind maybe sharing a reflection on that? I mean, I know you're moderating, but I think you and your team are really kind of leading in this critical space, and would love to hear an insight or two from your team's work.
Yeah, you know, I want to talk about the language difference of field and movement. I think that one struck home for me, in part because my scholarship has been around professionalization in some degree of the people who support this practice of engagement in higher education. And you know, when you talk about formalizing and professionalizing, right now you're starting to talk about field building. Now you're starting to talk about this sort of the hierarchy and rules through which people achieve identity and then, you know, move into certification, professionalization, things of that nature. Ibarra has a beautiful conception of professionalization that stands very counter to that. It's around an iterative deepening of commitment to mastery. So that's actually the conception of profession that I prefer. This idea that in and with a circle of critical friends who understand deeply the work that we are trying to do, we iterate and deepen the commitments and familiarity that we have with how we show up in the space, with how we do the work, with how we partner. Now, that is movement, right? When I think about the definition of movement, it's around the coalition building and aligning with people that can help us to iterate and deepen the work so that we can move forward. And so that's where we start to cross out of field and into movement. And when I think about what we've been doing at the University of Pittsburgh and who we've brought into the work that we do, it's not role specific. It's not about you came out of this particular vein of higher ed, or you were this kind of, you know, this was your employment path. No, it's actually about really foregrounding the change that happens in communities and our connection to that, and then being able to bridge back into the institution opportunities for collaboration and partnership. So that framing was important to me, that we talk more so about movement than we did field, because I don't know that there would be a field that exists that supports exactly the kind of practice that we have at Pitt. I think there are pieces of it that are maybe have resonance in certain fields, but I think it's more akin to movement building for us. And I'd be curious if what you think when you hear me say that, and if that resonates for you all.
There are definitely some points of resonance for me in terms of thinking about this work as movement, largely because I think that the communities where this work happens don't necessarily identify as part of our field. And so if our work is centered in community, if we want our work to be community-led, as it is in Michelle's work and the work of the Public Science Project, then we are more authentically at work with communities when we recognize ourselves as movement, as part of movements, part of movements, than if we stick to this notion of recognizing ourselves as a field. I do think that there's a space of field for our scholarship and for the writing that emerges from the efforts that we are making in community. And I think that the work itself is should be based in movements and what is happening in communities and the ways that we are seeking to align with those movements.
So I think I want to be greedy and do both. So I want to say, like, epistemic justice for me is a movement. It's a recognition that knowledge is produced in a variety of places, that expertise is widely distributed, and that in our work, the people who are most intimate with injustice should lead the inquiry. That feels like a movement, and it's got porous borders on who's an expert and who's involved. And Shoshi Kessie, who's a South African scholar, is actually arguing that, like, epistemic justice must come prior to even transformational revolution on the ground. Like, until we recognize that knowledge is produced in communities under siege, that will change all the wrong things. But I'm also interested, and I think you all have done it, in occupying the academy. in reclaiming these commitments in academic spaces. I don't want to just work out of the academy, even though I mostly do. I want to reclaim or claim these commitments and practices as a part of academic, as an obligation of academic, as a joy of academic work, as what Haney and Moten might call the undercommons. But I don't want to trivialize it, nor do I want to. I want to insist that the academy has an obligation to be doing this work, and as all of your positions suggest. And in that way, I don't know that we're building a field, although critical psychology has a long lineage, and so it feels to me both and maybe it should live between so that it never gets comfortable. I mean, I was around for the early days of like women's studies and African American studies, and in some places they've gotten a little comfortable and they've left the ground, they've left the community, they've left the movements, and so maybe this work has to sit in that tension.
I appreciate that, Michelle, and I think the audience chat is rich right now. There's a question coming in about how higher education institutions, but specifically predominantly white institutions, change the focus of academic outcomes that perpetuate white normative standards to more liberatory outcomes, especially for students of color. And Tania, I would love to touch to you here on this one, if you're comfortable. I think some of the work that you've done to exploring positionality and the racialization of service learning it feels really appropriate and relevant to this for me.
Well, I think that one of the things that higher education hesitates to say out loud is who these institutions were built for, and therefore who can still be received as interlopers or intruders in that space, even in some instances where students of color are quickly becoming the majority, right? There's a concept in higher education that's quite popular in thinking about sense of belonging and recognizing that students need to know or feel that they belong in an institution. And it is really hard to create a sense of belonging in an institution that was not built for you. And so what are the ways that we need to rebuild in order to generate a space of inclusion that truly is? And I think one of the first instances of that work is to actually name it, and that we need to acknowledge the ways that our curricular structures, that even some of the concepts of majors and what people major in are built for very specific populations, and that we need to really rethink them fully in order for higher education to be a space that can truly respond to and embrace the diversity that is its new demography.
Nina, can I, as Tania was sharing that and this really important question, and I'm thinking on what Michelle also reflected on, of, another thought that came to me was like, how do you move from a sense of insurgency to then governance, and what's the role of higher ed in all of this? And maybe this is just kind of a prompt that kind of squeezes in between the last few comments. President Parnham from Cal State Dominguez Hills, who's president there, said, context informs content. So, we can't talk about the current context and content of community engagement really without remembering the long history and tradition of higher education's public mission. And that evolution of that mission has always been tied to social issues in tumultuous times. And as the three of you were kind of contemplating and kind of threading together some thoughts. And I was thinking about historically Black colleges and universities. You know, the first HBCU, Cheyney University in Pennsylvania, 1837. America was still steeped in slavery. And now today you have over 100 HBCUs. You know, you have land-grant universities signed into law 1862 by Abraham Lincoln, over 200 campuses, land-grant campuses still around today. Tribal colleges, universities, Hispanic serving institutions, minority serving institutions. You know, when you calculate all of that, that's well over 1,000. So I guess I only share that. Well, and let me kind of fast forward that, you know, kind of rising out of tumultuous times. Because I will say that's how I got into this work. I love how Tania frames her entry point into engagement, civic community engagement, public service. Because similarly, I felt like I was in this adjacent field of community economic development. And, but, you know, I firmly believe that higher ed, what is this role of higher education? You know, a good example, University of Pittsburgh. Jonas Salk, I believe, helped develop the vaccine for polio there, right? So this idea where scholarship meets the public good. And at the same time, these really important questions that the audience is asking here. And then a really important reflection, you know, it's just haunting. I don't have like an answer to it, but it just kind of continues to add to my historical polarities of doing this work. On the one hand, how do you know, the institution seems equipped to help raise awareness, and so that's a comfortable space. It's not equipped to deal with some of the radical implications of what that change should look like. And then it seems like we kind of default into how we respond with any critical movement that's emerging, which gives rise to the fact that if we think of how it has been a really mixed response in terms of how institutions, corporations, frankly, have responded to last summer, right? I think the verdict is still out in terms of, do we feel good that, you know, everyone is quote unquote woke now? So anyhow, that's just, again, I don't have an answer to it. It just struck me as all of you were reflecting, as well as seeing the questions from the audience, that's a big question mark that I know many of us still grapple with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, Chris, to pick up on that, I want to invite Michelle into this with me. You know, Michelle, I want to know from your perspective, so what is the role of white individuals in this higher education system in this sort of racialization of engagement or public science, knowledge production, right? Because this is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit. I mean, the University of Pittsburgh, predominantly white institution, right? And the frame of racialized organization holds very tightly for me in the way that we carry those norms into our work. And I'm just curious from your perspective, how you've negotiated that, narrated that. Where are you at with that?
Yeah. You know, the reason in the early part of the interview that I corrected your question from your work to our work is that now I'm never doing work alone, whether it's research or activism or even teaching. And the Zoom world has gotten me invited to like 1,000 things like this, and I never do them alone. And I almost always do them with a colleague or a friend or a former student from the Global South, because nobody needs to hear from me for an hour. And yet I think as white scholars, we need to be calling big questions about whose knowledge counts, who are we teaching, why are we still insisting, if we are, on GREs or SATs when elite universities have moved away from them, when COVID has taught us the only gift of COVID is actually you could do admissions without standardized tests, where we have to be asking, to what extent are our grants supporting community-based movements rather than academics? To what extent are we opening up our universities to students of color, to faculty of color, but to bridging projects that will push the borders that Chris and Tania have discussed, and not let people hate on Tania because she dares to say some things that make white people look at our shoes and think, oh, it's probably true. It sounds a little angry. Like, we need to step that up. We can't wait for our colleagues of color to have to raise the issues we know to be problematic issues. Where a colleague and I are co-teaching a course called Decolonizing Psychology at a time when Black Lives Matter. And it's an amazing excavation back into both the dirty, eugenic, white supremacist history of psychology, but also the radical scholars and activists who were whited out, many of whom were scholars of color, right? Kenneth Clark had this whole radical life that I learned about from friends who were incarcerated, where he worked in the prisons. He never published on that because he had to do a bit of the respectability work. So some of it is rethinking who's in the university, but what's the larger project of the university? It's white people. We need to step back, be quiet. I'm not that good at quiet. I'm working on stepping back, but to do with alongside, and to dare to name the privileges that those of us who are white know we get. Whether it's getting our kids diagnosed so they take untimed SATs, or the same cop who's beating up on the young people I work with is walking me across the street, that we need to name those dynamics, the large ones and the small ones. And we need to interrogate our curriculum. The question about academic outcomes that privilege white normative standards, I'm not exactly sure what they are, but I think I have a good sense of what those are. And we need to reimagine, like, why is time to degree such a big issue? Like, why do our university, I have students who like took care of their sister's babies because they went to Iraq, and it took her 17 years. She should get an award. She shouldn't get letters every semester saying, you still haven't finished. So we've got a whole set of normative practices that are punitive and exclusionary, falsely framed as merit. And I guess the last small example I'll use, a lot of my students are pushing back on what constitutes a literature review these days, because they're studying issues where the dominant literature is epistemically violent to the communities they've cared about. And so they're not wanting to see themselves in that legacy, but might do a second literature review using hip hop lyrics to talk about men who lead a street life rather than just the academic. So from the minor to the large, I feel like those of us who are white need to step back, but also not force Tania and Chris to be saying things that we know are true because we benefited from them. Mm-hmm. Although I like when Tania and Chris talk.
As do I. And so to that end, Chris, Tania, we are discussing sort of the pain points around this work, right? The moments in which we've got a little bit of friction, but I'm curious, how has your involvement in this larger practice of engagement, how is that life-giving for you? Why do you keep coming back into the space, even as a critical friend, or even as somebody that has a tensioned moment? What for you is the promise of that?
Dr. Mitchell, please.
Well, I'll start with something that Chris started with as well, and that's relationships. At the heart of this work is the opportunity to be in relationship, and I've probably too often fall back on Nadine Cruz's definition of service learning as that alignment of intention and action toward more just relationships, right? I'm consistently striving to build the relationships in my own life that I want everyone to have access to, that create, again, those generative, thriving communities. I've been thinking a lot about the pain points in particular. I think most every all of you, the four of you, the three of you know that I am in Minneapolis. I live 3 blocks from where George Floyd was killed. And that my neighborhood has been a source of community, is a source of community transformation. I just got a survey in the mail yesterday that asked what I want to see happen at that intersection. And there were 2 options in the survey. And the first was to move a sculpture, which has been pretty widely viewed. If you look at any pictures of either 38th in Chicago or George Floyd Square, you'll see an iron fist sculpture that sits in the center of the intersection. And the options that were given on the survey were to move the sculpture, relocate the sculpture, or to build a roundabout around the sculpture. Those are the only 2 options. The site, as it has remained since Mr. Floyd was murdered, is an autonomous zone. There is no traffic there. What if we made it a park? What if the ice rink that my neighbors made in the center of the street was allowed to remain as a site of recreation and joy? What if the bus shelter that has been transformed into a clothing depot for people who may need access to warm hats and shoes? It was -40 here last week, y'all. What if that was allowed to remain, right? What if the resources that the community has asked for that have shown up in the space of mutual aid were given opportunity to flourish and thrive, rather than us turning back to what was? What was in that space wasn't good. It was a space where a man was murdered by police officers. And so the opportunity to imagine new, to imagine different, and to do that in relationship with others who have similar values or even differing values, but also really want to thrive in the spaces where they live, is, I think, what continues to bring me back to this work.
Yeah, I love that, Tania. This idea about people-place relationships. And, I guess for me, I would say no matter the institution or organization or kind of work we are in, it seems that people and relationships is pretty central to that. I mean, I even think like DoorDash is all about making you happy by getting you food right away. Now we could talk about, do we have shared values? Are we effective? And, that's another kind of workshop. But I would say at the core of all of our work, I think, is about to this central point of what Tania was saying, which is about people, place, and relationships. And, when I think about communities and colleges and universities and what is our tether of obligation, I think was a question that you wanted us to consider, Lena. The idea of co-creating and shared wisdom and knowledge is the goal. Now, as Michelle was intimating earlier, there could be critiques or concerns, and there are valid critiques and concerns, especially when we deviate from co-creation to exploitation, inequity, and power. But ultimately, as it relates to academia, our work and mission solely is about the people and the public, right? And I guess I don't think these have to be competing interests with the academic enterprise. The theme of this session about progress through partnerships remind us that wisdom and education happens everywhere, in communities, in the home, through elders, in the neighborhood. The idea of mutual aid, is so important given everything that's happened this past year. So, the idea of what keeps me coming back, it is this tether of obligation, not just personally or within my own community, but, in the work that we do. And it's, as I was mentioning earlier, I really do think, and I firmly believe, it is rooted in the role of academia and higher ed. Now, I know the past 10, 15 years, we can debate, the rising cost of education, debt, all of those have been, the corporate model of academia has been scrutinized. And obviously, there are big question marks over this past year. And I think those are valid arguments, but I think fundamentally, the obligation is that universities are indeed public serving, and that's kind of keeps me in it. Again, I think about the community engagement centers at the University of Pittsburgh is really an important example of how anchor institutions are building deeper relationships by co-locating in the community, being led by community wisdom holders as a way to recognize social capital and wisdom of a neighborhood. So I think it's an important moment for society to try and find where can we work together despite all this polarization. I was listening to a podcast, I guess, kind of lastly thinking, well, what keeps me coming back and what am I drawn towards? And I was listening to a podcast by someone talking about the French sociologist Durkheim and this idea of what he called collective effervescence. And I love that term. It's like, it feels communal, like a covenant. It's that feeling you get at church or a large community event or any kind of communal experience where despite your differences in background, there's this sense of rooting towards some shared values and hopes. How has that transpired this past year? I think many of the marches calling for the end of racism and systemic oppression and brutality last year. I think the COVID memorial in Washington, D.C., where that nurse sang Amazing Grace on January 5th. I think it's the sense, I know that many felt after Amanda Gorman shared during her inaugural poem. Or I think it's like how many of us feel, that communal feeling we get during times when we're just out in the community with faculty and students working together, and to Michelle and Tania's point around kind of like this really kind of participatory collective project or idea or thought. So to me, our mission focused on people and relationships is the tether. It's an unbending focus on sustaining them for the long haul. And I think we just have to remind ourselves how to rebuild our collective effervescence. And I guess that's what I'm hoping for as a society as we move forward in 2021.
So I'm hearing from these last 2 points, right? This sort of shared dreaming and collective effervescence, the ability for us to co-create future, right? It necessarily implicates that higher ed is both a part of and responsive to the larger world. We're in it. We're not separated from it. It's not us, them. It's all together. And I noted that in the chat, there were a couple more questions coming in around, what would it look like if the university was as responsive to community as they are to donors? What does it mean for engagement now that we've just come through COVID-19? And I think the answer is, in both instances, very simplified. It's a dialing up of responsiveness that we can and are and can be even greater in our response, because it's a shared future. And that's a heavy and inspiring moment, that it's a shared future. I want to thank Michelle and Tania and Chris. This has been a wonderful hour. I want to make sure that our audience knows that they can tune in to those longer recorded dialogues, because this was just a taste of some of the wisdom that our colleagues here were sharing with us. And again, it's so good to be in conversation and communion with you all. Thank you.
Be safe, all.
Thank you. Be well.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Lena.